Hi, my name is Sebastian Heineking, and I will be presenting the paper Trigger Warnings are Grounded in a Shared Vocabulary. This paper is the joint work by the following people of the Webers Group, and it's published at LREC 2026. To start us off, I would like to briefly talk about trigger or content warnings. These warnings are placed in the beginning of media like videos or texts to inform the audience about potentially distressing content. It's important to note that trigger warnings are not the result of research in clinical psychology. Instead, they were developed in online forums, specifically forums discussing sexual abuse. As a result of that, there's also no central definition of what requires a warning or how trigger warnings should be formulated. Instead, they are applied by uncoordinated individuals that make their own value judgments. Lastly, trigger warnings are not limited to traumatic events, but instead they are used to warn about diverse topics. Overall, this raises the question, can we trust trigger warnings? And we want to approach that question from the perspective of computational linguistics. To explore this question, we looked at texts published on the fanfiction website Archive of Our Own, short AO3. On AO3, people can publish their own stories about characters from popular culture, like movies, books, or video games, and when doing so, they summarize their stories with a set of free-form tags. These tags can be either character names, like on the right side you see characters from the Marvel Universe, but they can also be used to communicate warnings. While AO3 provides a set of 5 official warnings, one of them being graphic depictions of violence, the authors also create their own warnings. So these freeform warnings can be direct things like child abuse, but they can also be more implicit, like Howard's A+ parenting. To make sense of all these different tags, there are volunteers on AO3 that organize them. So for instance, the tag abuse has the subtags sexual, emotional, and physical abuse. In addition to subtags, you can have synonymous tags. So for instance, implied emotional abuse is synonymous to emotional abuse. To study the trigger warnings applied on Archive of Our Own, my colleagues created a taxonomy of 36 different trigger warnings that you can see on the right. And these detailed trigger warnings are in turn grouped under higher level concepts such as abuse or discrimination, and distinguish if the harm is of psychological or of physical nature. This taxonomy is part of a dataset of 7.8 million works that you can access with the link below. And my colleagues have used it both for annotation studies and to train classifiers to apply the labels assigned by the authors. What they found is that on the one side, it's difficult to assign trigger warnings because trigger warning annotation is subjective, so different people disagree about the type of content that requires a warning. And sort of related to that, automated methods like classifiers struggle to apply trigger warnings to texts. These challenges have led to our first research question, which is, are warnings lexically aligned with the vocabulary of their texts? So we take a step back from annotations and look at the underlying data. As a first step, we define a dictionary of terms related to a warning. So for instance, we define the warning emotional abuse, and the dictionary for that warning contains terms like manipulate or gaslight. Then as a next step, we identify documents that were tagged for that warning. So this could be emotional abuse as a literal tag, but also synonymous tags like content warning, psychological abuse. In addition to that, we collect documents to be used as a reference, which are marked here in blue. So these reference documents are all the documents tagged for different forms of abuse. In this case, trigger warning abuse, so no qualification, only abuse, or physical abuse, which is a different form of abuse than emotional. And then using these dictionaries and these corpora of documents, we perform frequency tests to see if documents with an emotional abuse warning contain a term like manipulate significantly more often than documents tagged for another form of abuse. For our experiments, we have selected 3 warning categories, namely sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. For each of these categories, we have defined a dictionary of terms related to it, and we have manually annotated tags as communicating one of these warning categories. Specifically, we've collected 5,600 tags communicating some kind of abuse warning, and then manually annotated them for communicating either sexual, emotional, or physical abuse, or in the case of the example on the right, both emotional and physical abuse. Based on this tag annotation, we've then created the corpora that you've seen on the previous slide. So we have one corpus DCI that consists of documents tagged for the warning. In the case of emotional abuse, this corpus contains 50,000 documents. And then we have a reference corpus of documents tagged for all other forms of abuse, which in the case of emotional abuse consists of 2.87 million documents. To test the differences in term frequency, we use the Mann-Whitney-U test, which I will leave here on the slide for reference and won't go into detail. The general idea is we want to test if a term occurs significantly more often in documents with a warning than in documents without the warning. To have an effect size, in addition to the Mann-Whitney-U test, we used the log ratio of corpus level term frequencies. So we aggregated the term frequencies on corpus level and calculated how much more often a term occurs in the corpus with the warning than in the corpus without the warning. For each warning category and each term in the respective dictionaries, we applied the Mann-Whitney-U test and calculated the log ratio and got the following results. For emotional abuse, we see no correlation between the evidence as shown by the z-score on the x-axis and the effect size measured by the log ratio and shown on the y-axis. The only exception to that are the verb gaslight and the noun gaslighting, which have a lot of evidence for a higher frequency and log ratios of greater than 3. On the aggregate level, we see that 190 terms from the dictionary are significantly more frequent in documents tagged for emotional abuse than in documents tagged for other forms of abuse. And we have one term that is significantly less frequent, which is the noun infringement. For the log ratio, we observe a confidence interval between 0.2 and 0.33, and we have 9 terms that have a log ratio of greater than 2. For physical abuse, we see 130 terms that are significantly more frequent and actually 20 terms that are significantly less frequent in documents tagged for physical abuse. So this means that documents tagged for abuse without further qualification actually contain these terms with a higher frequency than documents tagged for physical abuse. The confidence interval for the log ratio is also lower at 0.07 to 0.18, but we have a few terms with a lot of evidence and higher log ratios, like the noun beating and the noun bruise, which both have very high z-scores and a log ratio close to 1. For sexual abuse, we have a different picture. There we have 11 terms that both have an effect size, so log ratio of greater than 1, and occur significantly more often in documents tagged for sexual abuse. A couple of examples are the verb molest, the noun rape, and the verb rape, which have higher log ratios and a lot of evidence. Looking again at the dictionary, we have 7 terms that are significantly less frequent, 125 that are significantly more frequent, and 101 terms that do not differ significantly between the two corpora, noting here that the dictionary for sexual abuse was smaller than for the previous 2 warning categories. The confidence interval for the log ratio is the largest for the 3 warning categories, lying between 0.21 and 0.36. So it's marginally shifted to the right in comparison to the interval for emotional abuse. To summarize the findings of our alignment study, we find that documents tagged for emotional, physical, or sexual abuse also contain terms from their respective dictionaries with a higher frequency than documents tagged for other forms of abuse. For all 3 of these warning categories, we found outlier terms that both have a lot of evidence for a higher frequency as well as a high effect size. For physical abuse, however, we found the overall lowest evidence as well as the lowest effect sizes, suggesting that documents tagged for abuse without further qualification share a lot of the physical abuse vocabulary. In our first study, we went from terms to documents, so we defined dictionaries of warning-related terms and tested if these terms occur significantly more often in documents with the same warning than in other documents. Now we want to go the opposite perspective and go from documents to terms. Specifically, we want to ask, are highly frequent terms semantically related to the warning? So we want to know if frequency tells us something about how related a term is to a warning. To answer that question, we first retrieved passages that contain high-frequency terms. So we defined a set of 100 high-frequency terms consisting of 50 terms from the dictionaries that we used in the first experiment, and an additional 50 terms that we selected based on frequency alone. For emotional abuse, one example for the dictionary terms is gaslight that we've used previously, and an example of additional terms is the adjective awful, which we didn't have in the dictionaries before, and which we added based on frequency. Then for these terms, we identify a set of 10,000 term passages. So passages in the texts tagged for emotional abuse that contain these terms. You can see 2 examples there. As a baseline to compare these passages against, we also mined 1,000 random passages. So we collected passages of texts from documents tagged for emotional abuse that did not contain any of the 100 high-frequency terms that we've defined above. For each of the 11,000 passages, we simulated annotations using sociodemographic prompting. The idea of sociodemographic prompting is that you define a sociodemographic profile that describes the age, education, gender, and so on of a person, and then ask an LLM to simulate an annotation as if given by that person. The specific task that we had was, does this passage require a warning for emotional abuse, for instance? Because we created 10 different profiles, each passage could receive up to 10 positive annotations. So the example you can see below, the random passage here receiving 0 positive annotations, and the gaslighting passage receiving 8 positive annotations. This gave us distributions of annotations for each term, which you can see here. So you see that gaslighting has a lot of passages that received a lot of positive annotations, whereas awful received fewer positive annotations on its passages. Again, we apply the man with the U test, so we compare the distributions against each other to test if the passages for a given term receive significantly more positive annotations than random passages. As an effect size measure, we calculate the share of pairs between the 2 passage sets in which the term passages receive more positive annotations. For gaslighting, for instance, in 85% of the pairs between a gaslighting passage and a random passage, does the gaslighting passage receive more positive annotations than the random passage. Our results show that manual curation is necessary, as the dictionary terms consistently receive more positive annotations than the non-dictionary terms. Specifically, we observe that 54% of the dictionary terms for emotional abuse receive significantly more positive annotations than random passages. The same is true for 76% of the physical abuse dictionary terms and 68% of the sexual abuse dictionary terms. Comparing the different warning categories, we observe that physical and sexual abuse have more terms with significant results than emotional abuse. This is true both for the dictionary terms as well as the non-dictionary terms. To summarize our key takeaways, the first study looked at lexical alignment between the trigger warnings and their texts. Here we find that the 3 abuse warnings that we studied are aligned with the vocabulary of their texts. However, we found the lowest evidence and the lowest log ratios for physical abuse, suggesting that documents tagged for abuse without further qualification have an overlap in vocabulary with that warning, more so than they have an overlap with emotional or sexual abuse. In the second study, we looked at the semantic relation between the warning and high-frequency terms, and we find that some highly frequent terms are semantically related to their warning. However, it's not enough to go by frequency alone, but manual curation is required to identify semantically related terms. We also find that physical and sexual abuse are more easily captured on the lexical level than emotional abuse, suggesting that emotional abuse is a more implicit phenomenon that has to be identified through semantics and not just through vocabulary. Now I just want to thank you for your attention. If you're interested, you can find the paper and the code through the following URL, which is also given through the QR code. Please reach out if you want to discuss this further. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.